Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wright here. Just going to do a quick lesson today on the Holodomor, or the genocide in the Ukraine. So let's get started. The Ukrainian genocide, okay, what was it? So the Ukrainian genocide is known as the Holodomor, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that exactly correct. But it's a man-made famine that exists in the Ukraine between 1932 to 1933. Now, this takes place a few years before World War II, as you can see. But basically, what happened here is that Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator of the USSR, the Soviet Union, systematically implemented some laws and some quotas on the Ukrainian people, which caused a famine to occur in the country of the Ukraine. This resulted in the death of somewhere between 6 to 20 million people. Again, those estimates will vary depending on where you are. 10 million is kind of, again, that middle ground that you'll see the most often. So Holodomor translates to death inflicted by starvation. And in this genocide, we don't see death camps, we don't see concentration camps or anything like that. What we see instead is we see government policy restricting food and using starvation as a weapon against the Ukrainian people. Now, the goal of this was to wipe out all cultural, religious, intellectuals in the Ukraine, essentially to remove anybody with strong ties to the country of the Ukraine, to make the Ukrainian citizens more obedient to Soviet control in the entirety of the Soviet Union, which the Ukraine would have been a member of right now. So its goal is essentially to eradicate all opposition to collectivization. Collectivization we'll get into in a little bit, but essentially it's when Stalin made all Ukrainian farms stop being privately owned, and instead took several farms, pushed them together to create large farms. So we're going to go through the timeline here. It's in way more detail than you need to know. We're just going to look at it. We'll go through it all, and I'll kind of expand on some points that are important for it, but don't worry if you don't need to remember all of this. So in 1891, the first Ukrainian settlers come to Canada. Of course, we're going to talk about Canada because we live in Canada, and they come specifically to the West. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are Ukrainian or have Ukrainian relatives, but Ukrainian immigrants come to Canada from what would have been the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. So in the 1890s, the Ukraine was part of Austria-Hungary. Now, in 1900, the Ukrainian lands and people are divided between their loyalties to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and to the Russian Empire prior to World War I. The Ukrainians are kind of in a different position here where they're kind of Slavic, but they're not fully Slavic. So some people are loyal to the Slavic Russians, and some people are more loyal to the Austro-Hungarians. Now, the majority of the Ukrainians lived under or were loyal to the Russian Empire. Now, in 1914, Canada entered World War I as part of the British Empire, which is known as the Triple Entente, that alliance. And in Canada, the Ukrainians were actually interned. So if you remember back to a few lessons ago when we talked about conscription and internment, the Ukrainians that were from the areas of Galicia and Ruthenia, which would be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were actually put into these concentration or these internment camps to keep them separate from the rest of Canadian society because they were seen as potential traitors or spies for the Austro-Hungarians. Now, in 1915, 1916, the Armenian genocide takes place. So this is within that second and third year of World War I, where the Turks committed genocide against the Armenian Christians, which lived in the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, in March of 1917, the Russian Revolution occurs, which takes Russia out of World War I. It breaks up the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire will then become the Soviet Union once Lenin takes power. And Ukrainians see this as their opportunity to break away from the Russian Empire and set up their own temporary government separate from Russia and separate from Austria-Hungary. Now, in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks succeed in winning the Russian Revolution, taking over Russia. 1918, the Ukraine declares its independence and declares themselves the Ukrainian National Republic, so an independent nation state. In 1918 to 1920, the Ukraine attempts to establish and remain an independent state while fighting against the Bolshevik Communist Red Army up in what is now the USSR. The Poles and the Romanians on Ukrainian soil were also involved with the Right Army, which are the group that wanted to reinstall the Russian monarchy to power. And in March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ends the war on the Eastern Front with Germany. The Ukraine signs as a separate country from the now formed United Soviet Socialist Republic, led by Lenin Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. And the Bolshevik government led by Lenin, Trotsky is a member of the Communist Party, acknowledged that the Ukraine is a separate country. Now, in 1919, the Ukraine is left out of the hearings on self-determination. They do not participate in the Treaty of Versailles. And as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, the Ukraine is not seen as a separate country at the peace talks. So essentially, the rest of the world is not necessarily recognizing their independence. In 1918 to 1921, the Russian Empire, or the Soviet Union, is basically fraught with civil war. And the Ukrainian territory, which borders Russia, sees a lot of battles where the red and white armies are clashing. Again, the reds being the communists, the whites being the monarchists. And the Ukraine just kind of caught in the middle of those two groups. Then in 1920, we had the Bolsheviks gain control of the Ukraine with the aid of the Red Army, and all Ukrainian leaders go into exile. So essentially what happens here is the Ukraine is invaded by the Red Communist Bolsheviks, and the Ukraine loses its independence, and they become part of the USSR. Now, in 1921 and 1922, there is another famine in the Ukraine. 1.5 million Ukrainians will starve to death. Now, this is not part of the Holodomor. The Holodomor. It's a separate man-made famine that occurs about 10 years before. But it's the same idea of what we're going to see once we get into the 1930s, with food being taken away from the Ukraine in order to feed Russian people and Russian cities, kind of prioritizing the needs of the Russians over the needs of the Ukrainians, which essentially is ultranationalism. In 1921, the new economic policies brought in by the Russian Bolsheviks to help rebuild the economy of the Soviet Union. And essentially, it allows for small farm holding, permitting Ukrainian farmers to continue to farm their private land plots and running their own small businesses. Now, this is different because if you remember, the USSR is a communist government. In communism, there should not be private businesses or private farms. They should all be run by the government or the state. But the NEP was quite fair to the Ukrainians that it allowed them to still maintain some level of private ownership of business. Now, in 1922, the Ukraine is formally brought into the Soviet Union as a republic, with Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, which is declared as the new capital of the Ukraine. Now, in 1924, Lenin, who is the leader of the USSR, dies, and Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin enter a power struggle to see who will be the new leader of the USSR. It will be Stalin. In 1925, the Ukrainianization policy is brought in as part of the indigenization policy of the USSR. This was done to essentially appease the nationalistic Ukrainian population and its demands to encourage Ukrainians to join the Russian Communist Party. So essentially, the government in the USSR is going to allow for the Ukraine to keep their culture and their language. And as a result, hopefully these Ukrainians will start to join the Communist Party of the USSR. So a cultural renaissance arises as the Ukrainian artists, writers, film directors embrace the call to continue developing their own culture, and the Ukrainian language is encouraged and flourishes in schools and government offices. Because of this, some Ukrainian intellectuals do decide to join the Communist Party of Ukraine. Now, in 1928, Stalin takes complete control of the Soviet Union, and the Communist Party introduces his first of his 5-year plans. Stalin's 5-year plans are essentially like goals that he had for every 5 years, and he was actually quite good at accomplishing them because as a dictator, you can, right? You can force people to do whatever you want. Now, one of these goals was collectivization and industrialization. Collectivization is, again, taking those small independent farms and land plots and businesses and pushing them together into one big state-ran farm in this case. So in 1929, the Russians and the Soviets, or the Russians/Soviets, launched an attack on the Ukrainian national elites. So essentially, they're attacking anyone that could be seen as a resistance leader for the Ukrainians against the Soviet Union. They arrest 700 members and put them on trial for essentially their crimes of wanting an independent Ukraine. In 1930, the Ukrainian autocephalous, that's probably not so right, Orthodox Church is liquidated and their leaders are imprisoned and executed. So the Ukrainian religion is completely banned. In 1929 to 1930, the dekulakization, kulaks were wealthy Ukrainian farmers. So dekulakization would essentially be to get rid of them. And over 1.5 million farmers and families in Ukraine are sent to Siberia. Siberia is that really north cold part of Russia. And they have things called gulags up there, which are essentially concentration or death camps. So these farmers are sent up there essentially to work to death or are executed. So The property of these rich farmers is taken away and transferred to the collective farms, and any uprisings against the government are essentially ended. 1932, Stalin prepares for his genocidal famine by setting unrealistic grain goals for the Ukraine. So essentially how this famine happened is that Stalin essentially set goals for what Ukrainian farmers and these collectivized farms had to produce for Russia. And what he did is he made these requirements and these quotas so high that by the time the Ukrainian farmers met them, there was not enough grain left over to feed Ukrainians. So essentially, it's sending all the food back to Russia while not leaving enough food in the Ukraine for the people to live off of. Now, this was a plan. This was the goal of feeding the Russian people and starving the Ukrainians into submission. So at kind of the peak of the genocide, 40% of all grain taken in the Ukraine was given to essentially the Russian government. Now, the 60% was left to feed the Ukraine. Now, if you need 100% to feed 100% of your population, having 60% means you can only really feed 60% of your population. So these farmers tried to live off their reserves until those essentially ran out. These farmers tried to flee the cities and to flee to Russia and Belarus in search of food. However, they were essentially rounded up and executed. In August of 1932, the Colescott property decree said that anyone stealing grain from the field was going to be sentenced to death. So people that were starving to death now, if they stole food, they were guaranteed to get executed. Villages that were unproductive were essentially punished for being unproductive by taking away all their manufactured goods and foods. So essentially, if you don't produce enough good, you can't get access to other things you might need to live. The villages are cordoned off by troops and left to starve. So essentially, nothing comes in and nothing comes out, and these villages essentially starve to death. In 1932, the Communist Party liquidates all non-government literary organizations in the Ukraine. So any sort of organization that would teach reading or have anything to do with reading would essentially be banned unless it was part of the Russian government. So 1932, widespread starvation hits the Ukraine, the Kuban and Caucasus. And in 1932, a secret decree blames Ukrainianization nationalist tendencies for the grain problem, essentially saying if the Ukrainians weren't so worried about fighting back against Russia, they would have enough grain, and the fact that they're not focusing on producing grain is the reason why they're starving. The Ukrainian language is banned in all places in the Russian Republic. The Ukrainian leadership is purged and replaced by non-Ukrainians, and Russification is brought in to essentially make the Ukraine more Russian. In January 22nd of 1933, a secret directive is sent to Kharkiv to close the border of the Ukraine and Kuban from the rest of the Soviet Union. Now, this was to prevent anyone from Ukraine trying to flee the Ukraine to find food, to essentially stop them there so that way they would starve to death. So within 6 weeks of this policy, 220,000 people are arrested, and many were shot or sent to those work camps, those gulags up in Siberia. 85% of them were sent home to starve to death. Now, the Red Cross, which is a humanitarian group, and Cardinal Initsier demand permission to send famine relief, but Moscow denies that, saying that there is no famine. June to July of 1933, at the peak of the famine, up to 28,000 Ukrainians are starving to death per day. In 1933, Hitler comes to power in Germany, and the United States recognizes the USSR as a legitimate government. So up until this period, the communist government in the USSR was not actually seen as a legal government, and the United States refused to actually acknowledge the power of the USSR or the power of any of their leaders. Now, in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, the United States can kind of see that Hitler might be the worst of the two options and decides to recognize the USSR as a legitimate government to try to gain an ally in Europe. In 1934, the USSR is invited to join the League of Nations, ignoring the genocide that had just happened in the Ukraine. If the League of Nations was a serious organization, they would not have allowed a genocidal country to join the League of Nations. So you got some pictures here. You've got some children starving to death over here. You have pictures again of Ukrainian farmers that look very, very similar to those in the Holocaust. You got a newspaper from Chicago which says 6 million people perish in Soviet famine. Again, 6 million is kind of the low end of the genocide. You'll see those numbers all the way up to 20 million in some cases. So between 1932 to 1934, approximately 4 million deaths are attributed to starvation within the borders of the Soviet Ukraine. Now, this does not include deportations, execution, or deaths from ordinary causes. So 4 million directly attributed to starvation, and the other 2 million plus, at least according to the numbers that we're seeing here, would be due to these other factors. Now, Stalin denies to the world that there is any famine in the Ukraine and continues to export millions of pounds of grain into Russia. All the grain he takes would have been more than enough to save every starving man, woman, and child. Now, with any genocide, we are going to have denial. So the Soviet Union and Russia still to this day adamantly refuse to accept that the Holodomor was actually a genocide. And at the time, the Soviet Union refused any outside assistance, claiming that the regime officially denied there was any famine. So while this is all going on, the USSR is essentially saying it's not happening. Any country that said it was happening was accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda, basically just blaming the Russians because they were communist. Now, Western governments had adopted a passive attitude towards the famine, partially because they needed the Russian ally. Although most of them were aware of what was going on, they just kind of chose to ignore it for diplomatic reasons. In 1933, FDR, who was the leader of the United States during World War II, chooses to formally recognize Stalin's communist government and negotiate sweeping new trade agreements. However, the pattern of denial continues the following year with the admission of the Soviet Union to the League of Nations. Those nations who are unwilling to disrupt the lucrative trade agreements of the Soviet Union in order to pursue the matter of the famine. So countries that were making deals with the Soviet Union essentially said, we need them as an ally. We need them as essentially a group to trade with. And because of that, we'll ignore their crimes in the Holodomor. So this map here, and you'll see it better in your version. Right now in 2020, all the countries in red in here, the dark red, recognize the Holodomor as a genocide. So you got the United States, Canada, you got some South American countries, Australia, Spain, Portugal, and then around into here, and you have the actual Ukraine. All the gray countries deny that a genocide actually happened. And then kind of the pinky color, which you'll see Spain, Austria, Argentina, and Chile down here, they acknowledge that a criminal act took place, but they don't actually call it a genocide. So it wasn't until the 1980s that scholars began to write books and publish them based on what had happened in the Holodomor. A documentary came out that brought attention to it. In Soviet Ukraine, of course, the Holodomor was kept out of the media until the 1980s, shortly before the Ukraine won its independence in 1991. Now, when the Soviet Union fell, a whole bunch of records that were previously unachievable or unaccessible were given out. Testimony of survivors was given, and a whole bunch of evidence came out proving of the genocidal famine that happened in the 1930s. On November 28th of 2006, Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of the Ukraine, passed a decree defining the Holodomor as a deliberate act of genocide. Russia still calls this a one-sided falsification of history. Now, the first Holodomor memorial in the entire world outside of the Ukraine, of course, is actually in Edmonton, down by City Hall. So this was the first, in the first large-scale academic study of the famine, there was an estimated 5 million deaths from the famine from the period of 1932 to 1933. So you've got a painting here, you've got another monument. And then this is where the sources used for this can be found. So I hope you guys enjoyed that lesson, and I will be back soon with another one. Talk to you later.